This is the first of two video lectures on Carl Schmitt's work, The Concept of the Political. So I'll just say a few words about Carl Schmitt at the beginning here. He was a legal philosopher, a political philosopher, and actually a member of the Nazi Party. He is famous, besides being a member of the Nazi Party, for developing an account of the sovereign that is tied to this idea of the exception, that the sovereign, what makes the sovereign is the fact that they have the exception, whereas law is the universal, as well as accounts of dictatorship, of course, the concept of the political, these notions of political theology, and so on in his other works. So in this lecture video, we're going to focus mainly on what he defines the political to be, the friend-enemy distinction. So Schmitt says that, when we look at other disciplines, so if we look at like moral philosophy, if we look at economics, if we look at aesthetics, we know what the natures of each of these domains are. And he says the moral, for example, is defined by the opposition of good and evil, right? So we talk about moral things in terms of whether they are good, whether they are evil, or somewhere, along the spectrum in that way. So we define perhaps the actions of someone who kills someone else just because they enjoy it as being actions of an evil person, right? And that judgment is a judgment from a moral perspective. So what determines that it is evil is morality, not aesthetics, for example. Because aesthetics is determined by the distinction between beautiful and ugly. And Schmitt says economics then is determined by the profitable and the unprofitable. There are, of course, other domains, theology, and so on. So we can talk about all kinds of different domains that all different kinds of disciplines study. And what makes up that discipline is, for Schmitt, this opposition between, for when we talk about morality, good and evil, when we talk about aesthetics, beautiful and ugly, economics, profitable and unprofitable. And the problem for Schmitt is that many political philosophers, they want to reduce or eliminate the distinctly political domain in favor of saying, well, perhaps politics is just applied morality, right? Good government is that which is moral, and bad government is that which is evil, So justice, for example, would be that which aligns with moral principles of justice. Or take the case of, from a more Marxist perspective, Schmitt's going to say, well, look, the Marxist wants to just say there's no really distinctly political domain. It's actually all economics. That would be like the brute or vulgar Marxist conception of the political. But Schmitt wants to say, is there something that's distinctively, a distinctive opposition that we can say characterizes, that makes up the nature of the political, a distinct domain that is the political? And he thinks there is. Now, before we get to what that is, first we have to understand that Schmitt thinks we can't just say, well, yeah, of course there's a distinct domain that's the political, and it's whatever relates to the state. So the state is the political. So when we talk about morality, we're talking about good and evil, but of course then when we talk about the political, we're talking about the state, and then we could say within the state whether certain things are, laws or the conduct of a leader, these kinds of things are morally good or morally bad. But Schmitt says this basically ends up turning into a circular understanding, because it basically says, in one way or another, that political is generally juxtaposed to state, or at least is brought into relation with it. The state thus appears as something political, and then the political as something pertaining to the state. Obviously an unsatisfactory circle. So this no more tells us what is distinctive about the political. Because if the political is the state, when we say what defines the state, right? So we move the question to the state. Well, what defines the state is the fact that it's political. It's where politics occurs. Okay, but what is politics, right? What is the ground that makes possible something that we call politics? Another thought would be, well, perhaps we could just say that the political is defined in relation to society, so perhaps certain desires of society, certain conflicts that arise in society. But Schmitt says, if that's the case, if we want to identify the political in relation to society and say it's a social phenomenon, then everything would at least be potentially political, and the political, then nothing more than everything else. Because if the political is associated with something that's social, well, everything in society is social, therefore everything is political. And if everything is political, there's nothing distinctive about the political. He says specifically, this results in the identity of state and society. In such a state, therefore, everything is at least potentially political, and in referring to the state, it is no longer possible to assert for it a specifically political characteristic. And yet, if we appeal to our intuitions, how we think about, for example, government, we seem to think there is something distinct when we talk about the state and the law that is not simply everything in society. We seem to think about it as something that, yes, it involves the state, but we also talk about politics, at least in the United States, as involving kind of, democratic deliberation and involvement in a civic process. But what is the basis of that civic process? In other words, we could ask, what is the telos? Why? Why are we engaged in the civic process? Why does the civic process exist? So Schmitt thinks there's one way in which we can understand the ground of the political. That is the friend and enemy distinction. If the moral is defined by the opposition or the distinction of the good and evil, the political is defined by the friend and enemy distinction. He says the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. So we really need to understand what this is, because, right off the bat, we would say, well, does that mean anybody that I consider my friend, that's something political? And clearly not, right? There's qualifications for how exactly he's thinking about the friend and the enemy. And he's thinking about them publicly. These are public terms. Now, the enemy is not simply an adversary. It's not a foe. It's not someone that I see as potentially getting in the way of my own pursuits, right? So, I want to defend my dissertation. I want to get a doctorate in school, in graduate school. And I say, well, I need funding to be able to do that. There's a limited number of, spots for funding. Thus, all the other students that are seeking a PhD in philosophy are my enemies, because they might get the funding that I want to achieve my goals, right? So there's something prudential in this way. But that's not quite right, right? The enemy for Schmitt is not simply that who might get in the way of my objectives. The enemy is characterized by being an existential threat. So Schmitt says here, the distinction of friend and enemy denotes the utmost degree of intensity of a union or separation, of an association or dissociation. It can exist theoretically and practically, without having simultaneously to draw upon all these moral, aesthetic, economic, or other distinctions. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He need not appear as an economic competitor, and it may even be advantageous to engage with him in business transactions. Now consider that, right? It might be the case that the enemy, who is an existential threat, it might be the case that, well, it's profitable to still engage with him. But he is nevertheless the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient For his nature, that he is, in a specifically intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflicts with him are possible. Now notice, right? It's not simply that the enemy is someone foreign. The enemy is a stranger, an other, someone we don't know, right? So we lack knowledge of that entity. It is that the enemy is existentially alien, that their alienness is a matter of life and death for me, or for us, for the body politic. These can neither be decided by a previously determined general norm, nor by the judgment of a disinterested and therefore neutral third party. So there's a lot that's going on here. Let me begin to break down some of this. So firstly, how can it be the case that, well, let me just say, what Schmitt is trying to do here in defining the friend-enemy concept is he's trying to say there's a distinctively political domain, and if we want to engage in politics properly, we ought to give full autonomy to the political, and not simply engage in, moral theory and then try to say, well, politics is just applied moral theory, so let's just appeal to, what the moral principles are. Because the political involves this kind of judgment. As he says here, right? Who the enemy is cannot be decided by previously determined general norm. We can't just appeal to moral principles to determine who the enemy is. And it involves, looking out into the world. It involves a kind of concrete antagonism. The only one who can determine who the enemy is, according to Schmitt, is the sovereign. This is what makes the sovereign so, exceptional. The sovereign is the one who can determine who is a friend and who is an enemy. Only the actual participants can correctly recognize, understand, and judge the concrete situation and settle the extreme case of conflict. Only those people, only those who are existentially threatened by the enemy can determine that that entity is an enemy. Each participant is in a position to judge whether the adversary intends to negate his opponent's way of life, and therefore must be repulsed or fought in order to preserve one's own form of existence, right? So it can't be the case that, for Schmitt, it can't be the case that, for example, the United Nations comes in and says, no, Hezbollah is not an enemy of Israel, or no, Israel, you're not the enemy of Hezbollah, right? Schmitt is basically saying it's only those participants that are existentially threatened. They are the only ones that can make that determination, right? So Schmitt here is really undermining the possibility of some kind of a global political body like the United Nations, for example. Only on the ground, the concrete entities can make these kinds of decisions. Emotionally, he says, the enemy is easily treated as being evil and ugly. And we've seen that in, the recent, war in Gaza that Israel has been waging, where there were references to, Hamas and Palestinians in Gaza being Amalek, right? This kind of biblical evil entity that needs to be vanquished here. And Schmitt, I want to caution, Schmitt is saying that is actually a misunderstanding of the political, right? We'll get to that in a moment. But he says, so in the heat of this antagonism, the individual who is able to make the friend-enemy distinction can make it emotionally. They can, because it brings out, the political brings out the strongest and most intense feelings and distinctions and categorizations. But he says, this does not, though, alter the autonomy of such distinctions. Consequently, the reverse is also true. The morally evil, the aesthetically ugly, or economically damaging need not necessarily be the enemy. The morally good, the aesthetically beautiful, and economically profitable need not necessarily become the friend in the specifically political sense of the word. Thereby, The inherently objective nature and autonomy of the political becomes evident by virtue of its being able to treat, distinguish, and comprehend the friend-enemy antithesis independently of other antitheses. So independent, right? The friend-enemy distinction is independent of all those other antitheses of the moral, aesthetic, and economic. And let me just say one last thing on this. He mentioned before, it can actually be economically profitable to engage in business with the enemy, and they can nonetheless be the enemy. How could this be the case? Well, let's say it's true that, let's say China is an existential threat to the United States, okay? As, members of the Republican Party, Trump has been saying for some time, it could still nonetheless be profitable for businesses, maybe even for the United States, right, to engage in trade with China. But that existential qualifier is something distinct that would say, but ultimately, the rise of Chinese dominance is an existential threat to the, hegemony of the United States in the world. So, assuming all those things to be true, that would be an example of where, we can see the case of the economic and the political still being distinct, where it can be profitable to engage with the enemy, and nonetheless, politically speaking, they could be the enemy. Okay. So an enemy is never the enemy of an individual. The enemy is always the enemy of a public. So that's important, right? No individual can determine who the enemy is. Only the body politic, only the sovereign can determine that. And the enemy is the enemy of the body politic, of a people. Schmitt says the enemy is also not the private adversary whom one hates. An enemy exists only when, at least potentially, one fighting collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. So they might threaten their way of life. The enemy is solely the public enemy, because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of people confronts a similar collectivity. The enemy is solely the public enemy because everything that has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to a whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such a relationship. So we could think of, I think maybe a clear distinction of enemies would be Ukraine and Russia, right? Each other sees the other as a threat to their way of life. The existence of the other is existential. Now, not the existence of of Ukrainian people, not the existence of Russian people, right? It's a conflict of states, of body politics. The enemy concept, then, contains the ever-present possibility of combat. Very similar, if you notice, to what Thomas Hobbes talked about in The State of Nature, where the war of all against all, in this constant conflict, is not a constant physical conflict. It's a constant state of the fact that conflict is always possible. And Schmitt is very much influenced by Thomas Hobbes. So Schmitt says the friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity, and war is the existential negation of the enemy. So not all enemies necessarily need to fight, but the fact that they are an enemy means the possibility of war is always present. Now, you can still have treaties and try to prevent war, but that doesn't mean they're still not an enemy, that there's still not the ever-present possibility of combat. So, as we'll see, it doesn't mean the case then that, the political always means that we have to be fighting constantly. But it's about recognizing, right, existentially, the threat to a body politic. So, as I was just saying, the concept of the political does not favor militarism, imperialism, or pacifism. In many ways, right, Schmitt is trying to say it's about security, right? The friend-enemy distinction and identifying the enemy is about security for the body politic. It's not saying we constantly go and fight all of our enemies, right? But we try and protect ourselves. Nor is it an attempt to idealize the victorious war or the successful revolution as a social ideal, as some thinkers in the early 20th century were doing. since neither war nor revolution is something social or something ideal. The friend-enemy distinction does not imply that one particular nation must forever be the friend or enemy of a particular other nation, because the enemy distinction is something concrete, and history changes, right? Ways of life change over time. That means there is nothing inherent in the other being an enemy, right? In many ways, this is kind of a critique of a genocidal politics, of saying, no, they're forever, there's something evil or inherently corrupt about them, we have to eliminate them. Schmitt isn't saying that. He says, the politics of avoiding war terminates, as does all politics, whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. What always matters is the possibility of the extreme case taking place, the real war, and the decision whether this situation has or has not arrived. I mean, think about the United States and Imperial Japan, right, prior to World War II. Enemies. And then they fight. And what happens? They become allies. Why? Why do they become, politically speaking, friends? Because the conditions of enmity between the two change. They start to trade and work with one another. In Japan, the body politic actually slightly changes. Thus, that's just one example, a historical example of where we can see over time, at one point in time, this nation is an enemy, then they become the friend. So there's nothing inherent in the enemy, there's nothing permanent in the enemy. The religious, moral, or any of the other antitheses can intensify political ones and can bring about the decisive friend or enemy constellation. So perhaps this is actually the case of China with the United States, that, well, it's an economic conflict, right? It's about trade, it's about markets, but that this can intensify, the competition can intensify to become a political conflict. It becomes a political conflict because, well, if a way of life depends on, being globally dominant in trading, and someone else starts to take those markets from you, well, then that starts to threaten your way of life. Thus, an economic distinction becomes a political distinction. A distinctly political situation, though, right? It's not that, well, economics becomes an economical, political war. It becomes distinct because the economic tension increases such that eventually it intensifies so much it transforms into a political situation. The sole remaining question then, Schmitt says, is always whether such a friend and enemy grouping is really at hand, regardless of which human motives are sufficiently strong to have brought it about. And that is the question that the body politic must answer, the sovereign must answer. Now, moral antagonisms, religious antagonisms, economic antagonisms, these can intensify to become political antagonisms. But it can never be the case that when we talk about something becoming extra moral or extra economic, extra religious, right? Thinking that, well, it's really not a political matter, it's a moral matter. That's why we have to go and kill people, right? That's why it's actually so dangerous when Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel says Palestinians in Gaza and Hamas are Amalek, right? Invoking a kind of moral religious designation. Schmitt says that moral justification for war is the most dangerous. That's when it becomes genocidal. That is when it becomes the case that you say, no, it's not just that I recognize the other as a political threat. Because remember, recognizing as a political threat doesn't mean you have to go to war. It doesn't mean you have to eliminate them. It means you protect yourself from them, right? You can do that through treaties. Sometimes it does mean war, right? But you do war in such a way to subdue them. But Schmitt points out when then you have an extra moral affair in particular, that is when you say, no, we have to kill all of who that, all who are immoral in this specific way. So he says to confiscate the word humanity, and this is why he actually thinks the idea of invoking human rights war for the sake of humanity, things like that. He thinks those are the most dangerous things because those do constitute genocidal conflicts. Because you say, for the sake of humanity, we have to eliminate them because they're a threat to humanity. So to confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity. And a war can thereby be driven to the most extreme in humanity. The irony, I don't know if you're seeing this, is that here we have Schmitt, perhaps the most famous political philosopher of the Nazi Party, a member of the Nazi Party, is kind of theoretically explaining why it was so dangerous for the Nazi Party to engage in genocidal actions against Jewish people and others in Europe. That it becomes not simply a political matter for the German state, but a kind of religious or moral matter that leads to genocide. And in this way, Schmitt really is warning against that. So further, he says, nothing can escape this logical conclusion of the political. If pacifist hostility toward war were so strong as to drive pacifists into a war against non-pacifists, in a war against war, that would prove that pacifism truly possesses political energy because it is sufficiently strong to group men according to friend and enemy. But what underlies the pacifism here is a kind of moralism, a moral opposition to war, to conflict. And Schmitt is saying you have to recognize your actions, your convictions are political. When you don't recognize that it's political and you think, no, it's truly something moral, that's when you lead to the most heinous of actions. If, in fact, the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war, then it has become a political motive, i.e., it affirms, even if only as an extreme possibility, war and even the reason for war. Presently, this appears to be a peculiar way of justifying wars, right? We go to war to prevent, think about, World War I, the war to end all wars. The war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. Such a war is necessarily unusually intense and inhuman because by transcending the limits of the political framework, it simultaneously degrades the political enemy into moral and other categories and is forced to make of him a monster that must not only be defeated but also utterly destroyed. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his borders only. He must be annihilated. So this is the political realism of Schmitt, trying to say, look, we can come up with theories that try to mitigate and prevent war. But to try and think, well, no, we can eliminate war entirely and live in, a utopian fantasy land, that's when you actually lead to the most dangerous kind of political activities. So this leads us to his critique of Marxism here, because remember, Marx basically tries to say, look, we need to look at the role of class and political conflicts. A class in the Marxist sense then ceases to be something purely economical and becomes a political factor, Schmitt thinks then. That the problem with Marxism is they basically take economics and make it extra economical. It becomes a political factor then when it reaches the decisive point of a competitor becoming an existential threat. So, of course, then he thinks, well, Marxists, communists, socialists, they obfuscate the political, and they too can lead to, very dangerous consequences. So let me read here 37 to 38. So Schmitt says that also a class in the Marxian sense ceases to be something purely economic and becomes a political factor when it reaches this decisive point. For example, when Marxists approach the class struggle seriously and treat the class adversary as a real enemy and fights him either in the form of a war of state against state or in a civil war within a state. The real battle is then of necessity no longer fought according to economic laws, but has, next to the fighting methods in the narrowest technical sense, its political necessities and orientations, coalitions, and compromises, and so on. Should the proletariat succeed in seizing political power within a state, a proletarian state will thus have been created. The state is by no means less of a political power than a national state, a theocratic state, a mercantile state, or a soldier state, a civil service state, or some other type of political entity. Were it possible to group all mankind in the proletarian and bourgeois antithesis as friend and enemy in proletarian and capitalist states, and if, in the process, all other friend and enemy groupings were to disappear, the total reality of the political would then be revealed, insofar as concepts, which at first glance had appeared to be purely economic, turn into political ones. If the political power of a class or of some other group within a state is sufficiently strong to hinder the waging of wars against other states, but incapable of assuming or lacking the will to assume the state's power, and thereby decide on the friend and enemy distinction, and, if necessary, make war, then the political entity is destroyed. So at one and the same time, Schmitt is arguing Marxism obfuscates the political, and then it actually destroys the political state. And that, again, is something dangerous. Because the existential threat of the enemy, it never just disappears just because you obfuscate it, just because you destroy the political state. And finally, Schmitt critiques what he calls the plural theory of the state. So, the plural theory of the state says that the state is simply one association that is comprised of many other associations which make up a society. So you would say, well, there are other institutions, economic institutions, family institutions, and so on, and the state is just one aspect of, civil society, we could say. Schmitt thinks that's a mistake, that we have to see the state as foundational for society. The state is something that is separate, it is autonomous, and it transcends all other associations or societies. And it does so because, Schmitt says, it contains, in Latin here, the jus belli, which is the law of war. It is the only entity which can declare war. Only the state can. And the war, the declaration of war, is what distinguishes then a civil society from a barbaric society in which there is, in the Hobbesian sense, a war of all against all. So Schmitt says, the state, as the decisive political entity, possesses an enormous power, the possibility of waging war, and thereby publicly disposing of the lives of men. The jus belli contains such a disposition. It implies a double possibility. The possibility first of the right to demand from its own members the readiness to die, and the right that they unhesitatingly kill enemies of the state. The endeavor of a normal state consists above all in assuring total peace within the state and its territory, right? So the primary concern of politics then we should see here is peace and security. To create tranquility, security, and order, and thereby establish the normal situation is the prerequisite for legal norms to be valid. Every norm presupposes a normal situation, and no norm, Schmitt is arguing, can be valid in an entirely abnormal situation. So the only possibility that you have economic associations in society, economic institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, a family, and so on, is if there is this peace and security. Only the ability to declare war for the sake of ensuring security for the community. That comes from the state. The state is then prior to all of civil society, and yet it is what makes possible civil society and therefore transcends civil society. It is something entirely distinct. So let me just look at a couple examples here of religious and economic communities or organizations where they clearly then lack this jus belli. So Schmitt says a religious community, a church, can exhort a member to die for his belief and become a martyr, but it can only do so for the salvation of his own soul, not for the religious community in its quality as an earthly power. Otherwise, it would then assume a political dimension. It would then become a political organization. Its holy wars and crusades are actions which presuppose an enemy decision, just as do other wars. Under no circumstances can anyone demand that any member of an economically determined society, whose order in the economic domain is based upon rational procedures, sacrifice his life in the interest of rational operations. To justify such a demand on the basis of economic expediency would contradict the individualistic principles of a liberal economic order, and could never be justified by the norms or ideals of an economy autonomously conceived. The individual may voluntarily die for whatever reason he may wish. That is, like everything in an essentially individualist liberal society, a thoroughly private matter that is decided upon freely. The economically functioning society possesses sufficient means to neutralize nonviolently, in a peaceful fashion, those economic competitors who are inferior, unsuccessful, or mere perturbers. Concretely speaking, this implies that this competitor will be left to starve if he does not voluntarily accommodate himself. A purely cultural or civilized system of society will not lack social indications to rid itself of unwanted perturbations or unwanted additions. But no program, no ideal, no norm, no expediency confers a right to dispose of the physical life of other human beings. Right? Only the state can do this. To demand seriously of human beings that they kill others and be prepared to die themselves, so that trade and industry may flourish for the survivors, or that the purchasing power of grandchildren may grow, is sinister and crazy, right? Imagine your boss says, you need to go and kill the other workers in the other company because they're threatening our profits, right? Schmitt is saying that's crazy. Only the state can make such a demand of its citizens. It is a manifest fraud to condemn war and as homicide, and then demand of men that they wage war, kill, and be killed, so that there will never again be war. War, the readiness of combatants to die, the physical killing of human beings who belong on the side of the enemy, all this has no normative meaning, but an existential meaning only, particularly in a real combat situation with a real enemy. So I'll end with this. If physical destruction of human life is not motivated by an existential threat to one's own way of life, then it cannot be justified. So I'll end with two questions. So we've seen Schmitt here argue that there's a distinctively political domain, and what it is comprised of is the friend-enemy distinction, right? So we ought not to think of politics as applied morality, but as something distinct. And it is distinctive insofar as it recognizes that we have to secure ourselves from the enemy, who is an existential threat to our way of life. The first question I want to ask is, well, then how do we actually understand civil war? Because Schmitt says, well, what distinguishes the declaration of the enemy is that there's always the ever-present possibility of war. But we also speak of civil war. Would civil war not be a war among friends? How do we make sense of civil war in Schmitt's theory? Can we make sense of it? And the second question is, Schmitt seems to privilege the enemy. That really what distinguishes the political is not so much the friend. It's not that we make political friends. It's that, we only make political friends to do so to protect ourselves from the enemy, that which is the existential threat. So is Schmitt justified then in privileging the enemy over the friend?